So hi everyone, welcome back. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to start talking more about the theoretical connections around trauma and cultural responsiveness. So last week we did a webinar where I kind of walked you through my experience of growing up in a home with a lot of violence and showing you kind of how it was that the violence then my experience of violence became an experience of trauma, and then how that impacted the way I thought about the violence and then would talk about the violence. So before I move to the theoretical pieces, so today we'll talk about the trauma, like kind of what we know about trauma, and then look at what things you could do when you work with survivors to help them address the trauma, and then also recognizing the cultural differences and the impact of bias on survivors' ability to help. So before I do that, though, what I wanted to see is just if there were any questions that people had from the last week's webinar. So I'll just wait and see if you can chat any questions that you have in the chat box. And I'll just wait a minute or so just to see if anybody has any, and if not, then I'll move along. And Peter, I can't tell if anybody's typing anything in. I don't see anything, but I'm wondering.
Right now, we don't have any yet. We'll maybe give people a few more seconds.
Okay.
And if you have a question as Olga's talking, we'll kind of jump in and ask your question for you.
Yeah, and feel free to do that. I want to make sure that this information is as helpful to you as possible. So answering your questions would pretty much be my priority moving forward. All right, so Peter, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then just jump in if folks have a question. Okay, so again, my work on this is through the National Resource Center for Reaching Victims of Crime. It's a collaborative initiative that's funded by the Office for Victims of Crime and through the Vera Institute of Justice. And our organization is Latinos United for Peace and Equity at Caminar Latino. And we're their national initiative. All right, so a short recap from webinar number 1. I think you received an email with a link to the webinar. If you weren't able to attend last week, you can listen to it again. But basically, I kind of sketched out about some of the ways in which trauma forms that's connected to violence, and I used my own experience of violence as an example. And I walked us through the violence that I experienced starting, my first memory of it starting at age 3 and going through to my early 20s. And so we talked a little bit from an inside-out perspective about trauma and dissociation and the ways in which that can play out to how someone represents when they talk about violence that's happened to them, and how that's a normal response to trauma as opposed to what we think people should be doing, which is kind of a linear logical telling of what happened to them. So what I'm going to do today is kind of bring in some of the theoretical aspects of trauma and then try to connect it back to that experience. So I don't know about trauma. We know that there are basically four categories of trauma. There's interpersonal versus non-interpersonal trauma. There's ongoing or chronic versus single event. There's developmental trauma versus trauma that happens to people as an adult. And that's a pretty big distinction right there that we'll get into just a little bit. And then there's also trauma that's related to status or oppression. And again, that plays in quite a bit, but we don't always focus on it. We usually look at the violence that's happened to someone as opposed to the microaggressions or more than microaggressions that they're experiencing on a daily basis of oppression, and how that also adds to trauma. Kind of go through these. Interpersonal trauma is kind of in a single event. Examples of that would be like a trauma that results as a robbery, or a rape or sexual assault, a physical assault, a loss of a family member by suicide. These are all examples of a single event interpersonal trauma. So something that's connected to who you are and who you are to the person who is causing violence and trauma. Witnessing a loved one getting seriously injured or killed would also be considered a single event interpersonal trauma. Now, single event interpersonal traumas will play out differently than something that's ongoing, but still incredibly traumatic. So when we look at chronic interpersonal trauma, this is oftentimes what we're talking about when there's domestic violence or battering in play. What I was talking about last week in my experience, it was interpersonal trauma and it was chronic. So repeated and ongoing sexual or physical assault would be was where that would fit in. Childhood physical, sexual, emotional abuse or neglect. Stalking would also be chronic interpersonal trauma. And being incarcerated during a person's childhood could also be kind of this ongoing trauma that a child's experiencing in their home. So I'm kind of hoping that this is all just very basic, and non-interpersonal trauma is going to be a lot different. It doesn't have to do with who you are as a person or who you're connected to. I think that these traumas are a little easier to deal with because it's usually like a shared experience. So, for example, a human disaster such as a motor vehicle accident or a house fire, weather-related or natural disaster like an earthquake, tornado, or hurricane. And we've seen these quite a bit lately. Doesn't mean that they're not really, really hard, but there's an event that everybody has witnessed and that a community has gone through together. And that makes it a different experience than an interpersonal violence, or something that's happening to you because of who you are or who you know, and that is made about you, and maybe also lied about or hidden. So these are a lot different than that. So the hurricane that hit North Carolina and the subsequent flooding and stuff, it's a traumatic event for the people that have gone through it. But again, it's a shared experience, and it just feels a little bit different. Serious accidents or injuries at home or on the job are also non-interpersonal trauma. So some of you might hear my dogs in the background. Just no trauma going on there. Okay, so then there's trauma related to status, and I wanted to cover this and kind of think about some of the things that are happening today to people and how that might also have an impact on how you can work with them. So there's immigration or refugee status can be kind of thing that someone might feel oppression, and we're seeing that quite a bit right now across the world, really. Dislocation. So this could also be connected to a natural disaster. So, for example, people who have to leave their area for shelter, but then if there's a issue around bias or racism or oppression, that just compounds the trauma that's experienced because of the natural disaster. Torture and mostly what we're talking about in that situation. I mean, any kind of torture is going to be related, is going to be trauma, but what we're talking about there is politically motivated torture. War or genocide, these are really obvious combat experiences. Racial, ethnic, and cultural identity. So the kinds of oppression, the kinds of racism, institution that comes up around racial, ethnic, or cultural identity, like LGBT right now, might be another area where people are feeling particularly vulnerable, susceptible to bias. Socioeconomic status always adds to that, and disability is also one where, so all the ways in which people feel less than because of these statuses add to the trauma. So let me take disability as an example. If we set up all our programs assuming that people can walk, and assuming that people are able-bodied, then we're making it more for physical disabilities to access our programs. And if you think about all the ways in which physical disabilities might limit someone's access to any of the things that they need in their life, that just kind of compounds the trauma that they might have experienced. So thinking about how your programs are set up is a good place to start. Who can access them? Are they set up for people who speak English? Are they set up for people who are able-bodied, who can walk in, take the stairs? Are they set up for, like, is there an assumption that the people that you're working with are heterosexual? So that's an important thing to consider now while you have kind of an opportunity to think about how you're doing your work. And if it is set up that way, then to start engaging community-based programs that work with those communities, and asking for their help to see how you might change your programs, adapt your programs to make it easier for different communities to access them. And it might be that you partner with these organizations to provide those services. And let me just say that when we ask community-based organizations that are working with these groups of people, we don't want to just ask them to do this on a voluntary basis. We want to be able to pay for their expertise. They're already stretched doing as much as they can for the community members that they work with. So just to keep that in mind, we oftentimes as mainstream programs will ask folks, other community-based programs, to help us, but not pay for their expertise. A number of diagnoses that come up when we're talking about trauma, and what I wanted to do is just kind of name some of them and show you some of the symptoms that we see, and just kind of explain them a little bit. One of the biggest diagnoses that we hear about quite a bit is post-traumatic stress disorder, and the ways in which this will manifest itself. And usually it involves all these, but it doesn't have to involve all of them. So you'll have someone who's having nightmares or night sweats. They'll have a pretty high startle response, and they'll be hypervigilant. And so a lot of these things, and then they'll have flashbacks. the flashbacks are probably the easiest ones to identify as someone who's experiencing these, and the night sweats and nightmares might not feel like that's very different if that's been going on for a while. The hypervigilance, it becomes this thing that people just do automatically. So what they're doing is constantly assessing for safety, and they're just they're using their senses almost in a heightened way to determine whether a situation is safe or not. And what happens is all of these things, but in particular the hypervigilance, can be exhausting because you're moving through your world. You're going to work, you're going to work, you're doing the things that you need to do for you and your family, and you have this heightened sense of awareness that can take a lot of energy. And the more stimulation there is in your environment, the more difficult it is to constantly assess for safety. So you're taking in a lot of information. So when people have post-traumatic stress disorder and the symptoms are kicked up, you're going to see people with more fatigue. And with more fatigue, also a little less patient, might not be able to concentrate as well. So it kind of all builds on each other. So these are some of the symptoms that we see. And again, you might be hearing some of these from people, but not in this way. So they might just be having trouble sleeping. Might be because they're having night sweats and they don't know why. So anyway, okay. The other one is dissociative disorders. And next week on Tuesday, right, I think October 9th, I'll be doing the last in a series of webinars on trauma, which will cover dissociative identity disorder in particular. So I'll just touch on it here, and then just know that next week we'll be doing that. So some of the symptoms that you'll find in the dissociative disorders is people losing track of time. So losing periods of time, not losing like track of what time it is, but they might lose a couple of hours in a day, days in a week, weeks, months. For me, I was diagnosed with DID when I was 31 years old. And at that point, I couldn't remember any of the things that happened in my home when I was a child. So I lost all that time. And the things that I could remember were the things that happened outside of my home, which were things. So meaning I could remember what happened in school and playing sports and playing with friends and stuff like that. So that's that kind of dissociative fugue or amnesia that we've heard of, which is what the losing time is. There's also people that have dissociative disorders. One of the purposes of the disorder is to not feel. And so they'll report kind of feeling numb, like they're just kind of going through the motions of their life. And then one of the things that you'll also hear and see is people that feel spacey, and you'll see a bit of a stare, and then they'll talk about things that happened to them in a way. Well, this is true for anybody who's experienced trauma, but more so with people with dissociative disorders, as if they're not talking about themselves, as if their experience that they're speaking about didn't happen to them. So in a really flat manner, you'll see that. And that'll be more pronounced with people with dissociative disorders. And dissociative identity disorder in particular is someone who has created parts of them, who hold onto or have roles that they didn't feel that they could handle at the time that these things were happening to them. Then we have what's common diagnoses around trauma as people with anxiety or panic disorders, and then people with phobias, like agoraphobia we see, claustrophobia we see. And these are really closely connected. And there's some things that you can do. You don't really have to. So I want you to know about these diagnoses, but I don't want you to try to diagnose people. I just want you to know what you're hearing, what it might be when you're hearing it, so that you can then adapt to the people that you're working with, to help them kind of go through whatever process it is that you're engaged with them. So things that you'll see when someone has experienced trauma is you'll see a flat, you'll see a spacey look, and you'll hear a very flat demeanor. So someone might be talking about, I'll just use my example. So last week when I talked about being raped by my father when I was 3 years old, once I got through that experience through dissociation, then down the road when I talk about that experience, that incident of rape that happened to me, I talk about it in a really, really flat manner. It's as if that didn't even happen. And I could see it, the bits and pieces of it until I put it all together. But I couldn't feel it. And that process of healing then enables you to kind of put it back together in a logical, linear manner and then eventually feel it. But that's a really common thing for people who've experienced trauma. And the more that you see that space, you look in the flatter, the more distant and disconnected the telling of the experience is from feeling what happened to someone, the more trauma that they've experienced. It'll feel like you're working with someone who's not paying attention. And then at times it'll seem like someone is overreacting to seemingly benign situations. And I get this question a lot from judges. So the reason this is so important for people to know is that we're constantly assessing credibility of victims and perpetrators, but we're constantly assessing credibility of victims. And when we're talking about a legal system and a legal process, the people along the way, the law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, everybody along the way is interacting with this victim in around what happened to them, but not necessarily recognizing the signs of trauma and then misreading the signs of trauma. So the overreacting to seemingly benign situations is an issue that I've seen quite a bit. Judges bring up. There'll be somebody who's testifying about sexual abuse that happened to them, and they seem really distant and really flat. You can't tell at all in the telling of it that this really happened. It feels really disconnected. And then all of a sudden they'll start talking about something that happened to a sibling or a parent in the home. And then they'll be really upset, and that contrast will seem odd, and they'll assess credibility. They won't be able to, because they don't know that's kind of normal. They'll think that person's trying to pull something on them, like that they're making this up. And but if you put a trauma lens to it, the overreacting to seemingly benign situations is someone who's gotten triggered. And it makes sense that if something happened if they're talking about something that happened to someone else in the home, they didn't have to distance as much from it. So they can feel it. They didn't have to dissociate so much to get away from it. So when they talk about it as something that happened, that they witnessed and experienced. But when it's something that happened to them, they survived it by dissociating. And until they're able to kind of pull all that back together, they're going to talk about it in a way that's distant and minimizing. So anyway, so that's a sign, a thing that we see quite a bit. We also hear people minimizing the abuse, and this actually makes a lot of sense when you think about if that person is that person's just trying to get through. That person that experienced this is just trying to get through. So if people are like, oh my God, that's really awful, what happened to you? if you're not in a place where you can feel how awful that was, you're going to be like, yeah, you know what, okay, that it's okay. I've got coping skills. I can't tell you how many times I've said that to people that I'm like, yeah, I got good skills for that. And that's usually a sign that like, okay, I can't do that right now. I can't know how bad it was right now. So that's also another coping mechanism. The other thing that we see, and this is one of the top 3 things that I look for to determine whether someone's experienced trauma, and if that's what we're seeing. So that's what talking all over the place, and it's connected to the scattered, nonlinear thinking. And if you think about it, so when I talked about my experience last week, I talked about when I was 3 years old and my father raped me. I talked about how I experienced that from outside my body up in the ceiling, and in doing dissociating. And so I'm not feeling the full brunt of the physical or the emotional. So prior to dissociating, I realized that my father was about to hurt me, and I panicked. And then I dissociated within seconds. And I'm feeling really numb, and I'm collecting all this information through my senses. So through my sense of touch, smell, taste, my eyesight, all of this, I'm collecting all this information. But there are chemicals that are released in the brain because of the traumatic stress that hamper the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is where all your high-level thinking happens. It's how you put things in a logical, linear manner. And so when you talk about what happened to you, you're going to talk about it in a very scattered way because you didn't have the benefit of your prefrontal cortex to collect all that information and put it in a logical, linear manner. So this is why a lot of times when people have experienced trauma, that when they talk about the trauma and maybe other aspects of their life, they talk all over the place and they're scattered in their thinking and telling. And it could just be around the pieces of trauma. It depends on how much trauma they've experienced and over what period of time. But so that flat demeanor and that spacey look and that talking all over the place, those are the signs that say to me that this person has experienced something traumatic. And then what you want to find out is what happened. So the tricky part about trauma is that we can't always remember key facts because of the dissociation. And then the other ways in which I've seen people who've experienced trauma described is uncooperative or not following through. And I wanted to just talk about this for a second, because what happens when you've experienced something traumatic is once you start dealing with it, a lot of the feelings around it come up. And it's really easy to get overwhelmed. I mean, if you think about the stuff that we just talked about, it's people are hypervigilant, so they're constantly assessing for safety. The more stimulation there is, the more they have to take in. And so they're doing their everyday things. On top of that, they're constantly assessing for safety. And so the more and more that they get into what happened to them, the more and more these feelings from the emotions and the physical feelings will come up for them. And all of that can overwhelm someone. And then, so if you're going through that, but at the same time, you're really appreciative for people's help. And you might feel committed to a justice process, or you need some sort of system response. It might be that you're on college campus and you don't feel safe if the person that perpetrated the violence against you is in your classes, and you want to try to figure out how to feel more safe and stay in school. Whatever it is, you're going to try to comply with people's requests. So if you're working with a lawyer or you're working through a judicial action on campus or something similar, something that takes you through a system, the survivor wants to comply with the requests that they're getting. They want to be able to follow through, but all those things make it really hard to follow through. And you get overwhelmed really easily, but you don't know. So someone says they need, some kind of documentation from a survivor, and the survivor says, "Oh yeah, I'll get that." But the things that they have to go through to get that documentation or to participate in that hearing or judicial proceeding or whatever it is may feel insurmountable when it comes to time to do it. And it's because of all the trauma that makes it feel so insurmountable. So then people will seem to be uncooperative or not following through. And there are things that we can do to help survivors. One is that we can help them learn about what trauma feels like and show them the ways in which it's impacting their life. That's a huge relief a lot of time for survivors, to know that it's not really them, it's about something that happened to them and it's trauma, and this is normal for trauma. So that can be like a huge relief. The other thing is to not just ask people to do something, but to work with them to be able to do it. So breaking things down, helping people know the steps involved and know what to expect makes all of it much easier. And we'll get into this a little bit more as we go forward. So let me just stop there for a second and just check. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. And is that right, Peter and Megan? Okay, so let's talk about how trauma affects survivors. Okay, so, and this should all ring true to you. Like, this should match up with your experience of working with survivors in the past and now. So one of the hardest things as a survivor is to trust other people. And it's really hard. That's very, very connected to, if you think about it, it's really, really connected to interpersonal violence. So if the person that is supposed to be your confidant, your loved one, your partner in life is telling you all these things that you're, they love you and all this stuff, but they're perpetrating violence against you, that can kind of mess with you, in terms of trusting people. So how does it match up? The person loves me, but they're perpetrating violence on me. And oftentimes what happens is that you're blamed for their use of violence. And then what happens is, or if you grow up in a home, as I did, with violence, then the people who were supposed to protect you are actually perpetrating violence against you, and they're acting as though it didn't happen. So what's happening, what people are saying and what people are doing are not matching up. And the more trauma that you experience, the more likely the issue of trust is going to happen. So your experience going through life is that people will tell you things and it won't match up with what they're doing, and you can't trust them. So in walks a system to help you, either through an investigation or through child welfare or through, as an adult, any kind of system that's involved in sexual assault response. They're going to have limitations, and they're used to their system and they're used to their limitations, but you're not, as a survivor. And so they're telling you they're going to handle this, they're going to investigate this, they're going to prosecute this, all the things that you might want to hear as a survivor, but they're not telling you the ways in which they're limited until they're limited. And so then the things that they're saying isn't matching up with what they're doing. And we all work in our systems and we know them really well, but we don't know what it's like to not know those systems. So we're not always providing a full amount of information to a survivor so that they can make decisions and understand what's going on. Are inherently set up to create mistrust. And it's not it's not done to create mistrust, but it's a natural byproduct of it. So it's really hard for a survivor who's gone through that stuff to reach out for or respond to offers of help without even dealing with the system yet. In large part because you are blamed for someone's use of violence, or you don't know what's available to you, and you don't feel like you should ask. And a lot of times that comes up because of the experience of not deserving something or being worthwhile, like someone else's efforts you don't feel like you're worth those efforts by other people. I do a lot of peer support for people with dissociative identity disorder, and it is probably the most common thing that people will say to me, "Why are you doing this for me?" And I'll explain how, like, I get what it's like to have dissociative identity disorder, and I get how just terribly isolating it can be, and I want to be there because I know what it's like. And people they do not feel like they deserve it or are worthwhile, and it's really heartbreaking. This is really, really common. You don't have to have DID to feel this way, and you've probably seen it quite a bit with the clients that you've worked with. And then there's a lack of connection that can make it hard for someone who's experienced violence to develop and feel empathy. So what they end up feeling is they feel isolated, disconnected, and different than others around them. And then let's look at the different than others around them. If you add the microaggressions of bias and racism, then any kind of difference to the person that you're working with is going to be magnified. So I live in rural Wisconsin on the west central side of the state. The town that I live in has about 500 people that live in it, and the town next to where I live has about 15,000 people. And I'm a Latina with DID who's a lesbian, gender nonconforming. I'm lucky to be a citizen. I'm lucky that we grew up in the U.S. and that at 57 years old, I speak English really well, and you can't tell, I don't have an accent. I'm lucky about those things. I'm not saying that those things were necessarily good. Like I kind of had to erase my culture to be able to fit in. It's not really a cultural responsive way. But how safe do you think I'm going to feel if I'm raped today, going to sexual assault services in this area or calling the police? I am very different than the people around me. I pass as being similar, but there's all sorts of ways in which I'm different that makes me feel, because our systems aren't set up this way, that leaves me feeling less than when I need help. I walk through the world not thinking so much about feeling less than when I don't need help. And one of the things is that I'm lucky to be well-resourced, that I've done well in my career and can afford to pay for the kind of help that I might need. So anyway, I wanted to just kind of raise this because we oftentimes look at survivors from the outside in, and even sometimes when we have our own experiences of it, we're not connected to some of the things in which plays out for survivors. So it's really helpful to know that survivors have a hard time trusting. And so what you do in that situation is you try to pay really close attention to what you say and what you do. And they should match up. And if they don't match up, don't ignore it. Address it. It builds trust to recognize that you said you were going to do something that you weren't able to do for whatever reason. And then to raise the survivor so they know that you're paying attention to what you're saying, and you're paying attention to whether you do it or not. Okay, so another that trauma affects survivors is that we can develop coping mechanisms that can create other difficulties. And so some of the difficulties might look like aggression or dissociation or avoidance. So we might look spacey quite a bit, and as if we're not participating, we're not following through, or we might be using substances to get through something, or we might be doing self-harming behaviors, or engaged in risky behaviors, and risky behaviors to you. So a survivor will oftentimes feel like they're crazy, or feel confused, and this is in large part because of the effects of trauma. And so when these difficult strategies come into play, when they're checked out. So let me give you an example. I did some listening sessions in Florida in different domestic violence and dual shelters, and I had someone in my focus group, and they weren't engaged at all. And that's the person that'll stay after the focus group's over to talk to me about their experience. And in the listening session, I'll observe them, and I'll think, wow, they seem really kind of checked out. But they'll stay in the room. And then afterwards, I'll hear an experience of theirs which sounds really different than my experience of them. So I'll get a question like, how come you didn't ask me any questions? Or how come you didn't, like I felt like you weren't asking me. Whoops. My PowerPoint today. How come you're not engaging with me? And then as I talked with the survivor a little bit more, I realized that she's been feeling this way since she came into this program, that she didn't feel like the survivors, the advocates in the program were engaging with her. She didn't feel they liked her. She didn't feel that they wanted her to succeed, that they wanted to work with her. And when I talked to the advocates at the program, they were describing her as someone who didn't want to work, who was just taking up, basically trying to get free services, and in particular shelter services for 6 weeks. And it was actually not that. It was actually the trauma effects that were kicked in. So she was dissociating, and so people experienced her as checked out. And because she was dissociating, people didn't feel like they needed to engage her. They were waiting for her to come to them, the advocates. And so it creates this little environment. So if you have someone who seems really checked out, check in with them and see what's going on and see how you can help them. And I apparently am having a little issue with my PowerPoint. I have to quit this again and then turn it back on. Sorry about it. But the pleasant thing about it is that you get to see my dog. So he was 4 months old in this picture, just in case you were wondering. All right, go back to this. Okay. So, and how are we doing? All right, so hopefully this is going to work okay now. So what happens is that it's really hard for survivors to manage feelings when all this is going on. So, and the reason that it's hard is because it's hard to recognize them, it's hard to tolerate them, it's hard to regulate the feelings, it's hard to calm yourself down when you start feeling a certain way. It's hard to integrate those feelings of what's going, like the feelings either of what happened or the feelings we're experiencing right now. And all these things make it really hard to thoughtfully plan. So then you have survivors that seem tense and anxious, reactive and angry. And it's not because of the things that they're tense and anxious about and reactive or angry about. It's because they're having a hard time managing their feelings. And if you think about it, the thing that happened to them that was probably the worst thing that's ever happened to them is something that they didn't want to feel and are still probably distancing themselves from. And that can create all kinds of confusion in your mind, because how can that have happened to you that you not feel that? Okay, so what does this mean for your work? And hopefully some of the tips that I've been giving you all along will resonate for you. But let's go through them. And I am going to repeat myself a little bit because some of the things that's helpful is basic, and you'll see it in the slides. So I just want to make note. So the first thing is that there is an impact to privilege and bias, okay? And so you have to recognize your own privilege when you're working with a survivor. So you might have the privilege of never having experienced sexual violence, and that's great, but that might impact the way that you work with them. You might have the privilege, as I do, of being a citizen and working with people who are undocumented and recognizing that their experience is going to be very different than mine right now. Or the experience of being able-bodied or speaking English, all these different things that we take for granted because it's part of who we are. Those are things that make it easier to access systems and services. And it makes it harder for people who don't have those same things, who fall into groups where services and systems were not designed for. And then on top of that there's bias in people and institutions. So we have to recognize that those things are real in order to be able to do a good job with the people that we're working with. And then the other thing we need to do is understand the reality of survivors' lives. So I talk about how I've done peer support for people with DID. Well, so when I found out I had DID and I was 31, I was a lawyer and I had worked in private practice and then in the government for a few years. I had my student loans paid off and I was able to afford therapeutic help, and really expensive therapeutic help for a really long time. So I have to recognize that not every person that has DID is going to have that. In fact, most people have access to those kinds of resources. So if I just think that everybody needs to have therapy and have the kind of therapy I had for as long as I have, I'm not going to be particularly helpful for people because hardly anyone's going to be able to afford that, much less want to do that. So I have to understand the reality of the lives of the people that I might be doing peer support with, who I might get what the DID feels like and how that's really different and very isolating. But I might not get as well the fact that they're disabled because of the DID and can't work and can't hold a job, or that they are trying to maintain relationships with their families. There's all kinds of ways in which my privilege shows up in my life, and I have to make sure that when I work with someone that I'm not expecting them to have the same reality in their lives that I did at the time that I started to get help or that I do now. I've created kind of this world for myself where I can move through it pretty seamlessly. I have to remember that I did that and what I did so that I don't try to suggest to people that they do what I do now. That takes work and time to do. but sometimes it's hard to remember. So understanding the realities of survivors' lives is critical to our work with them. And bias and privilege is going to be an issue for survivors and their families, whether we see it or not. So what I do is listen to their challenges and listen to them in a way where we're trying to understand their experience and not trying to get them to understand us, meaning to ask questions that help you understand them as opposed to asking questions and having dialogue with them to try to show them where you're coming from. So first, try to get a sense of where they're at. So listen and have dialogue to understand. So then partner with survivors to address strategies to help. And in order to do that, you have to know, how will the system see this survivor? So when I think of myself as a person with DID, knowing that I might still dissociate, knowing that I might not remember clearly to me, I know that that's going to show up weird in a system response, that people are going to think that doesn't exist, she's making that up, how could these things have happened to her, and she doesn't sound like they happened to her, or how could she be so successful if these things happen to her? All these things are going to play out. You need to know how the system is going to see the survivor, either because of her race, because of her class, because of a disability, because of whatever it is. You have to be real about how the system is going to see the survivor. And what is their experience with police, immigration, and child welfare, and on and on? What's their experience? And again, asking questions to understand their experience, as opposed to explaining what the experience should be. So then that's when you develop plans for how to address these. And this is really critical. This is how you can be more culturally responsive. And then identifying what the survivor needs in order to get through that system. So it might be an interpreter. It might be better physical access. It might be knowing that your program is LGBT friendly. It might be working with a lesbian or trans person getting through the program. Whatever it is, you need to start kind of thinking about who's in your community and how do you work with them. And then when they come in, understand your privilege and how they've experienced bias in your community. And then also understand that, like, I might walk through the world fine and do trainings and stuff and, you know, and have a certain amount of status. But if I have to walk into a courtroom and talk about a rape that happened to me, all the things that make me different is what's going to push me out into the edges. It's going to marginalize me. So recognizing those things and working with me to address those things are just as important as the trauma pieces, because they are part of the trauma. So when we try to talk about trauma without the cultural responsiveness pieces, we're not being trauma informed, because we're not addressing the whole experience. Excuse me. Okay. So I'm hoping that makes sense to folks, and that also, if there are things that you have questions about or statements that you want to make, that you feel free to do so in the chat. Okay, so let's look at then, what is the impact of trauma to your work? So it's really important, and I know you know this, so just recognize that I'm really good at stating the obvious. So it's really important to be able to identify when trauma might be an issue for someone, so that you can partner with survivors to craft strategies that are going to help them. And the kinds of strategies that you're going to need to craft are ones that keep them safe, two, that helps them to continue to move forward with what it is that they want or need. So if you take one of those systems, for example, if she's in a university system and she's been raped, but she wants to stay in school and she wants to feel safe on that campus. But it might be that she was raped by someone at a fraternity, and that person's in her classes. What does she need to move forward to be able to continue to go to school? What system responses are there on the campus that she might need help with? The other thing is to recognize what the survivors are going to need help recognizing what some of the triggers might be and what they can do to avoid those triggers. And so, for example, if you go back to the school example, seeing that person again, or being around people that remind her of that person, or being in a crowd, or being in a tight space, in a closed-in space, those all might be triggers after a rape. And so to be able to kind of provide the survivor with some information and help her figure out how to avoid those triggers, or develop plans for when those triggers can't be avoided. Okay, and over time, what happens is in the process of healing, whatever healing a survivor decides to undertake, they're going to become more and more desensitized to those triggers. And you'll be more likely to be able to move through the world without being triggered as much afterwards. And it depends on the violence, the level of violence that was experienced. So right now, it's going to be to avoid the triggers, and then when you can't avoid the triggers, what do you do when that happens? So teaching a survivor what a trigger feels like, what it means in terms of dissociation or flashbacks or whatever, and then teaching them some grounding techniques so they can ground themselves back into where they're at here and now today. So what you want to do is you want to create trauma-informed services. And the way that you create trauma-informed services is that you attend to a survivor's emotional as well as physical safety. Okay, and that you assist survivors in strengthening their capacity to deal with the multiple complex issues that they face. And so to address issues of safety, to address issues around recovering from the traumatic effects of violence, abuse. So someone who would be working with me, if something happened to me today, would be working with me around what happened today, but then also the ways in which my lifetime of abuse has complicated things, has made it more difficult for me to participate in whatever process I'm working on with them, and it might make it difficult for me to work, for me to travel, for me to kind of do the things that I need to do in my daily life. And then to be able to assist survivors in rebuilding their lives. All survivors of violence have access to advocacy services that are inclusive, welcoming, and destigmatizing and not re-traumatizing. So these are the things that you need to have trauma-informed services. Okay, so you're not just addressing physical safety, but you're addressing emotional safety, and that you're helping survivors access the systems and the responses that are there, and that you're creating an environment where they can do that. So the components of trauma-informed services are providing survivors with information about the traumatic effects of violence. Okay, now there's a lot of information out there on trauma, on the symptoms of trauma, on dissociation, on sexual assault, on domestic violence. And there's a number of tip sheets that have been created, in particular for advocates, mostly for advocates of domestic violence, because that's where the funding has come from. But the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health have really, really helpful tip sheets about how to create welcoming environments, how to talk to survivors about trauma, and then tip sheets that you can give to survivors, like a tip sheet on the impact of trauma on energy. Because of the ways in which, so how I described like how post-traumatic stress disorder works and how someone's they're doing all the things that they're doing in their life, and they're having these symptoms, and they're assessing for safety constantly. That's exhausting. And how when you're triggered, your adrenal system kicks, and then and it kicks up in you in a way that then when it drops off, when you feel safer again, that your energy level just drops with it, and the impact on the body that has. And there's all kinds of information out there about trauma and its impact on the body, and how you have to also release trauma from your body as well as doing the healing that's associated with the trauma in your mind. So providing survivors with this kind of information is really powerful. So I always call it psychosocial education. So you can do this in support groups. You can have this information in your programs, and there's all kinds of tip sheets available. You want to know a lot about this so that when survivors talk to you about it, you know what you're talking about, so you can help them with this. This is the single most really powerful thing, is when survivors realize how much of what they're experiencing in their lives is a natural cause of trauma, and how trauma is connected to what happened to them. Then it makes them feel like they're not, all the things that they're saying to themselves that they're not lazy, that they're not stupid, that this is because these things happen to them. It's a really huge thing. Okay, so then the other thing you want to do is you want to be able to adapt your programs and services to meet the survivor's trauma-related needs. Now, you want to do this for survivors' trauma-related needs, and you want to do this for access purposes. So if you have programs that you only have in English, and you have a survivor that comes in that has limited English proficiency, then you need to provide an interpreter or access to your programs. And it's either through a cultural bilingual advocate, or an in-person interpreter, or a telephonic interpretation service. And it depends on the level of support that person's going to need, and the level of the number of people in your community as to which of these options you're supposed to have in place. Okay, so, and then the other ways in which you might want to adapt your programs and services is, so let me give you, if you require people to participate in a support group in order to participate in your services, and they may get triggered in the support group, is the requirement of the support group really necessary? Or is this something that you could do through one-on-one? If in domestic violence programs, in shelters, a lot of survivors have to share rooms. They can't lock their doors. Those are all really hard for people who've experienced trauma. It's hard to feel safe when you can't lock your door. It's hard to feel safe when you're sharing a room with someone you don't know. Create opportunities for survivors to discuss their responses to trauma. So again, having opportunities for them to learn about it and share their experience with other survivors and with advocates or clinicians. The other thing is to offer resources and referrals to survivors. So this is really important. The word offer is operative here. Offer, not require, mandate. Offer resources and referrals to survivors. So if you work with a program that has interpersonal violence, you're going to be working with people who experience trauma. You might want to know who in your area provides services to people who've experienced trauma. Which therapists can you refer people to? And do these therapists understand the impact of interpersonal violence? Some people have a different analysis as to what causes the interpersonal violence, and sending them sending survivors to them might actually raise their risk. It might not be a traditional therapist that a survivor wants to see. They might have a healing circle or a sweat lodge, or they might want to be part of a group that meets and just talks about how they're raising their kids, or a group that's of Latinos, for example. We see this quite a bit, that are teaching each other different skills like cooking and different craft making. It might be a group of people who are undocumented that are trying to figure out, so how do I get, because if I don't have a driver's license, how do I go through in this community and get the things that I need for my family? So there are different ways in which people can come together and still talk about what happened to them and still have healing. And it doesn't always have to be a therapist. So recognizing what those things are in your area, and maybe even creating some of those opportunities. And finally, reflecting on your program requirements and practices to see, are there things that are making it hard for your staff around trauma, and are there things that are making it hard for survivors who've experienced trauma? The thing that I would recommend is you want to try to normalize what happens to people when they've experienced trauma. This is really probably the biggest thing you can do. So discussing the link between trauma and violence is really helpful. Discuss some of the common emotional or mental health effects of violence and the ways that our responses can interfere with accessing safety, processing information, or remembering details. Like to know that chemicals are released in your brain when you experience trauma that hampers your prefrontal cortex, which means that then you can't put things in a linear logical order of that incident that happened. That's really powerful stuff to know. Like, you can't help that. So providing people with these tip sheets, I think, would be a good place to start. Discuss ways that trauma can make it hard to trust or manage our own feelings or affect the ways we feel about other people and ourselves in the world. Those would be really, really helpful for survivors. I know mine was really powerful for me when I realized that the things that I thought were limitations in my life, the ways in which I thought I wasn't as smart or as energetic or as good, when I saw how they were connected to the traumas of what happened to me, I felt so much better inside, because I was like, oh, I couldn't help those things, and I did all this stuff anyway. It can be really, really powerful. Create opportunities to discuss what's happened and the trauma and trauma issues. Once survivors understand the natural responses to trauma, it can be really helpful to think and talk about the ways in which this has happened to them. So how has the violence changed their lives? And how do they think about those changes? So this is really helpful in terms of ways in which to build connections with survivors and help survivors that they've experienced. The resources and referrals available, develop culturally relevant and community-based referrals and linkages. Who is in your community that's working with Latinos, that are working with African Americans, that are working with the disabled? Who is in your community that works with LGBT? And how can you partner with them in supporting the survivors that are in your community? And then let survivors know how you can help them through the access of referrals. So let them know what you have and who you can refer them to should they need it. And medical is another one as well. It can be really hard for survivors to get there, and it'll be really important for them to be able to do that. And then when we talk about reflecting on your practice, reflect on your responses to each individual survivor and how those responses are affecting them. Reflect on the impact of your work on your own life. Like, are you struggling through this? Is it really hard for you to support people who have experienced sexual violence or domestic violence or child abuse, or the ways in which you're working with the survivors at your program or in your system? And if you are struggling with this, look for ways to discuss this with your colleagues. And if these are the kinds of things that you might want to bring up to the people, to the leadership at your programs. Create opportunities to do this. And then look for tools to analyze how you can adapt services. And like I said, the National Center on Trauma and Mental Health, that's a good place to start. The National Sexual Assault Resource Center is another place to start. Looking for trauma-informed services. And then I have just a ton of stuff on trauma because it is my passion. And so you can always contact me, email, and I'll send you what I have. So let me recap a little bit. I want you to be aware of the signs of trauma, and these are the ones that I feel are the most prevalent. So the talking in a nonlinear manner, or tangents, or scatteredness, the flat affect or emotional detached when discussing the violence, the blank stare, which we know of as dissociation. And then they're unable to remember key facts. So the 4 things together tells you that this person has experienced trauma. And then the next thing is to try to, once you've seen the signs of trauma, to take steps to avoid triggering feelings that can be disruptive to the survivor as you work together. So let me stop there and just see if folks have any questions.
We are not seeing any yet, but let's give them a couple seconds. There's a little bit of a delay with the sound.
Oh, okay, good. Thanks, Megan. While I'm waiting, what I'm going to do is now in the chat. So if you have any more questions or want any of the handouts, you can just email me.
And Olga, if you have any follow-up resources that you just want me to send out to everyone, you can send them to me.
I'll do that. Okay, that's great. And then the other thing is that I'll, Megan, I sent this PowerPoint to Peter.
Okay.
And so people, you should feel free to give this to people,
awesome.
to all the participants, and there's lots and lots more slides in here, and it just kind of goes through the same information. I think this is a good place to start, and I'll send you some handouts as well. The one thing I'll just say, if you have anything else, when you're working with a survivor who's experienced trauma, making things as predictable as possible really helps. So helping people understand what to expect, and you want to do it as early on as possible. So for example, if you're part of, let's say you're a victim witness person in a prosecutor's office, and you're trying to get a survivor who wants to participate in a prosecution as a witness or wants to attend the trial because she's a victim of that crime, you want to start early, getting that survivor comfortable with the court process, where they're going to go, who the judge is going to be, where they're going to sit, if they testify, how that's going to go. So you want to start way in advance, and maybe even meet the survivor at court before the trial takes place, like days before the trial takes place, and have them walk through the door that they're going to walk through, go up to the courtroom that they're going to be in, maybe even sit in on cases held by the judge who is assigned to your case. Things, once that happens, that's the unknown that the survivor doesn't have to deal with that day. And the less and less, like the more predictable something is, the more likely someone is going to be able to go through it. And there's a tip sheet that kind of walks you through all that, which is called Preparing Survivors for Legal Proceedings.
Yeah, that is awesome. That is great advice. A couple people did chime in. These aren't exactly questions, just a couple of people saying to please send resources. And one specific request that was from a Latina advocate who works mainly with immigrant survivors. She's interested in some resources to educate her coworkers on working with Latinas.
Okay, great. Yeah, for that person, why don't you email me directly? And I'll share the information that I have, and then we can stay in touch too, because that might be more that we might do technical assistance with your program.
Oh yeah, that would be great.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Thanks, Megan, for hanging out with the little technical difficulties with my PowerPoint.
Oh, no, thank you so much for presenting.
Yeah,
and for sharing
pleasure.
your experience.
And so next Tuesday, we have part 3, right? So next Tuesday at the same time, so that's October 9th at the same time at 10 a.m., we're going to talk about dissociative identity disorder. And this is by far my favorite presentation. Mostly because it's really important to me that people know what it is and how, that it's real, how it comes up, what it is, and how you can help someone who has it.
I'm really excited for that one. Not that I wasn't excited for this one, but it's not an area I've gotten training on before, and I'm really excited to see it. And Alma will be back next time. She took some vacation time, which is good because anyone that knows Alma well probably knows that we kind of have to force her to take vacation time sometimes. So we're happy that this time she took it on her own.
Cool. That's great.
And thanks
nice
everyone so much for attending. Yeah, great to hang out with you too. Thanks again, Olga, for presenting. We'll see everybody next week.
Great. Thanks. Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye.